Have you ever stopped to consider that the civilization that most influenced our way of life might not have been Greek or Roman, but rather a people almost no one remembers? It's curious. We talk so much about powerful empires, but we forget the Phoenicians merchants who, without giant armies, conquered the Mediterranean with something much more powerful than weapons commercial intelligence. While other peoples built temples and palaces, the Phoenicians built roots and connections. And therein lies the paradox. They were small in territory, but immense in influence. They lacked fertile lands, but they fed entire kingdoms. They lacked invincible armies, but they dominated dangerous seas. A seemingly limited people who became synonymous with expansion. The controversy is that to this day, we underestimate their impact. If you write, read, trade, or consume products from far away, you're using practices that originated with the Phoenicians. Strange, isn't it? History has left them in the shadows, but the truth is, their mark is present in almost everything we do. And the quick reward for you who follow this story is clear. By understanding how the Phoenicians thrived amidst so many limitations, you'll also realize that your life's greatest obstacles can be transformed into paths of growth. If they managed to master the sea with so little, what's stopping you from turning your challenges into opportunities? Now tell me something. Where are you watching this video from? And what time is it there? I want to know how far our route will go today. Because in a way, we're repeating what the Phoenicians did millennia ago, connecting people from different places through a good story. Once upon a time, there was a small piece of land squeezed between the sea and the mountain. There, Phoenicia was born, a territory that today corresponds to the coast of Lebanon. Imagine waking up every day and seeing the sea before your eyes, but behind you, mountains that leave little room for planting. It was in this limited, almost suffocating landscape that the Phoenicians learned to create opportunities. And perhaps you've experienced this. When it seems the world gives you little space, that's when you learn to expand. The Phoenicians didn't have vast, fertile plains like the Egyptians or the Mesopotamians, so they had to hone their creativity. Think of it like living in a small apartment. You can't have a huge vegetable garden, but you can improvise pots on the windowsill. Instead of insisting on agriculture, they chose the sea as their backyard. The Mediterranean became a kind of avenue, and each wave seemed an invitation to explore. These humble origins shaped the Phoenician people's mindset. Growing up surrounded by limitations made them masters at finding solutions. They had nowhere to plant crops, so they sought out what they needed. And if you notice, this is still the case today. Companies born in hostile environments often create world-changing products. It's as if necessity were the driving force behind invention. But don't think it was a simple life. Imagine the smell of salt lingering on their clothes, the constant sound of the waves crashing against the makeshift harbors, and the distant sound of hammering on wood as they built boats. This routine became almost a daily ritual, something that shaped not only their economy, but also their identity. It was an entire culture revolving around the sea. It's interesting to note how early this connection with the sea began. While other peoples looked to the sky for divine signs, the Phoenicians gazed at the horizon, trying to divine what lay beyond. It's like that curious friend who, instead of staying stuck in the classroom, dreams of exploring the world beyond. The difference is that they actually went, and this would change not only their history, but that of the entire Mediterranean. And if this limited background already made them bold navigators, imagine what would happen when they discovered they could transform this limitation into wealth. Because from the simple act of observing the sea, they would begin to build upon it all their glory. But this brings us to another point: the role geography played in their daily life. Phoenicia was like a narrow strip of land, squeezed between the waters of the Mediterranean and the natural wall of mountains. Those who lived there knew space was limited, and this shaped their daily life. It was like living in a long, narrow house, where every corner needed to be made the most of. No waste, no over-the-top luxury. Life was about adapting. The mountains, though beautiful, weren't exactly conducive to agriculture. The limited rocky soil didn't lend itself to large-scale crops. Imagine trying to grow wheat in small pots in your backyard. The effort is enormous, and the return is minimal. This natural challenge forced the Phoenicians to think differently, to not rely solely on the land, but to look to the sea as their primary source of sustenance. The sea, in turn, offered not only food but also paths. It was as if a vast blue highway lay before them, connecting distant worlds. And let's face it, who hasn't dreamed of a giant avenue leading straight to new opportunities? For the Phoenicians, that horizon was both a promise and a risk. This cramped geography also shaped social behavior. The cities were dense, filled with alleys, markets, and busy ports. The smell of fresh fish mingled with the sound of negotiating voices, and the sea breeze carried conversations from dock to dock. It was impossible to live there without feeling the vibrancy of commerce, as if every corner were a gateway to the outside world. And it's curious to consider how this environment contrasted with its neighbors. While in Egypt, people saw the Nile as a generous mother, in Phoenicia the sea was a demanding father, unpredictable, challenging, yet full of opportunities. This contrast helped create a bold people, willing to take risks, always ready to set out in search of what they couldn't find at home. And so, with this limited space but full of doors opened by the sea, the Phoenicians began to design a unique lifestyle, a lifestyle that would inevitably lead them to transform their lack of land into an abundance of connection. And this leads us to wonder, what do you do when you have little to plant, but an entire ocean to explore? In Phoenicia, land always seemed a scarce resource. The narrow, rocky soil didn't support large crops, forcing each family to deal with the reality that food wouldn't come in abundance from their own backyard. It was like living in a place with no supermarket nearby. You either improvise or find a way to get it elsewhere. This scarcity, far from being a curse, became the engine of Phoenician creativity. Without vast harvests, they learned to look to the sea as an inexhaustible source of possibilities. It was as if the sea were the great fertile field that compensated for the poverty of the land. Those who fished knew each net cast was a chance to return with a plentiful table, and each boat carried not only goods but hope. Over time, this necessity shaped collective behavior. Sailing wasn't a luxury, it was a means of survival. Imagine if today, instead of going to the market, you had to take a boat to secure your weekly bread. This daily routine made the Phoenicians masters in the art of building vessels, planning routes, and venturing into unknown waters. And trade arose precisely from this scenario. What was lacking at home could be obtained elsewhere: grain in Egypt, metals in Cyprus, olive oil in Greece. They turned scarcity into opportunity, exchanging what little they had, like cedar wood and glass, for what they didn't produce. It's almost like that friend who knows how to negotiate everything, even when it seems they have nothing. This habit of foraging also generated a lifestyle centered on exchange. In the narrow streets, it was common to hear merchants' voices negotiating with different accents. The scent of foreign spices mingled with the salt of the sea. It was a multicultural coexistence born precisely from local needs. And this very scarcity, which could have condemned the Phoenicians to stagnation, ended up being their greatest strength. because by learning to conquer abroad what they lacked within, they built a network of contacts and routes that would change the Mediterranean forever. And when we talk about cities that stood out in this process, one in particular shines brightly: Tyre, powerful and influential. In Phoenicia, there was no large centralized empire, but rather independent city-states. Each had its own ruler, its own laws, and even its own rivalries. They were like sisters, different, full of personality, but united by a stronger bond. Tyre, Sidon, and Byblos were the most famous, and each stood out in its own unique way. Byblos, for example, gained fame for its connection to Egyptian papyrus, so much so that the word Bible derives from its name. Imagine the prestige of being the entry point for a product that would become a symbol of knowledge throughout the ancient world. It was like being the distribution center for books at a time when few could read. Power, influence, and wealth always went hand in hand. Sidon, on the other hand, shone with its maritime tradition and refined craftsmanship. Its artisans were experts in glass, jewelry, and textiles, products that aroused desire wherever they went. Think of a modern city that is a benchmark for fashion or design. Sidon played this role in the ancient world. When something came from there, it already carried the seal of sophistication. And Tyre was the jewel in the Phoenician crown. Located on a fortified island, it seemed built to withstand invasion. Rich, strategic, and teeming with merchants, it became synonymous with power. It was like an ancient New York, where business was nonstop, and every arriving ship brought news from around the world. Whoever controlled Tyre controlled a good portion of maritime trade. These city-states, even independent, knew they needed each other. The fisherman from Sidon sold to the merchant from Tyre, who traded with the scribe from Bai. It was an interconnected interkent, like a vast marketplace where each stall had its own shine, but all were part of the same fair. This constant exchange was the secret of Phoenician vitality, and of course, we can't forget the power of these cities wasn't limited to economics. They carried cultural symbols, religious traditions, and even political policies that would influence neighboring peoples. But for all of this to work, there was something essential: the ships that cut through the waves, carrying riches from one port to another. The Phoenicians knew that to master the sea, they needed to master the art of shipbuilding. Their vessels weren't improvised. They were the result of centuries of observation, trial, and error. Each wooden plank, carefully adjusted, became part of a body that glided through the waves. It was like assembling a puzzle where each piece needed to fit perfectly to survive the unpredictable sea. These ships were robust, but also fast, a rare combination at the time. Many peoples had strong but slow ships, others light but fragile. The Phoenicians found the balance. It's like comparing an armored car to a sports car. Somehow they managed to combine protection and speed. This made their trade routes safer and their profits more consistent. The secret lay in the Lebanese cedar wood, renowned for its strength and durability. Imagine the smell of this freshly cut wood permeating the air of the shipyards. The sounds of hammers, the shouts of carpenters, and the steady rhythm of the work created almost a symphony. These ports were not just departure points, but veritable factories of maritime dream. Furthermore, the Phoenicians developed techniques that would inspire other peoples. They created different vessels for different functions: cargo ships to transport goods, fast galleys for defense and exploration. It was like having a fleet of specialized vehicles, from delivery trucks to racing cars. Each ship had a purpose and was treated as part of a larger system. These robust vessels allowed the transport of not only goods, but also ideas. With each voyage,
They carried not only fabrics and metals, but also stories, beliefs, and customs. It's like when we travel today and return with photos, memories, and new perspectives. Phoenician ships were both merchants and messengers. Then the most fascinating thing is to realize how this naval technology was the springboard for everything that would come after: longer routes, more distant colonies, and a seemingly endless trade. But of course, none of this would have been possible without the most valuable raw material they possessed: cedar wood, which sustained their ambitions over the sea. The Lebanese cedar was practically a treasure to the Phoenicians. Tall, imposing trees with broad, sturdy trunks, they seemed tailor-made to face the sea. When someone cut a cedar, the sweet aroma of the wood would spread, as if nature itself were present in the construction of the ships.
This wood was not just material, it was a symbol of strength and longevity.
The Phoenicians knew how to choose each trunk with precision. They didn't just use any old piece. The selection was meticulous, made by men who understood the secrets of the forest. It was like choosing quality ingredients for a recipe that needed to be perfect. And indeed, by using the right wood, ships gained impressive durability, capable of crossing long distances without falling apart in storms.
This cedar also carried symbolic value. In several ancient cultures, it was seen as a sacred tree, linked to immortality. Imagine the impact of traveling on a ship made of a material that was not only strong, but also considered divine. For many Phoenicians, sailing on these vessels was like having the protection of the gods, an invisible shield against the dangers of the sea. The cedar trade itself became important. Neighboring peoples, such as the Egyptians, desired this wood to build temples and palaces. Thus, in addition to building their ships, the Phoenicians profited by exporting logs and planks. It was like having a star product in the catalog. Anyone who wanted something durable knew they needed to trade with them. The sound of saws cutting through cedar, mixed with the wind blowing from the mountains, was part of the daily routine in coastal town. The work was hard, but also filled with pride. After all, each ship built wasn't just merchandise, it was proof of the skill of transforming nature into movement, wood into adventure. And it was precisely thanks to this resource that the Phoenicians expanded their horizons. Because if the cedar gave them the means to cross the Mediterranean, it was their courage that determined how far they would go. And as they began to move away from their shores, something extraordinary happened: a maritime expansion that would forever change the history of trade. From the 12th century BC onward, the Phoenicians began venturing ever further into the Mediterranean. Their robust vessels allowed them to go beyond familiar waters, exploring territories other peoples had never dared imagine. It was like a young man who, upon leaving his parents' home, decides to discover the world with courage and curiosity. Each voyage was a step toward transforming limitations into opportunities. At first, the routes were short, passing through Cyprus, Egypt, and Crete, but soon Phoenician ships spread like threads of a web, connecting the eastern and western Mediterranean. Imagine a vast network of invisible roads across the sea, connecting peoples who had never exchanged a word before. Trade became a bridge between cultures, and the Phoenicians became the architects of this connection. Each port visited was a new discovery: aromas of spices, sounds of strange languages, objects that seemed too exotic for those who lived on the Lebanese coast. It was like traveling today to markets in Asia or Africa and returning with luggage full of new things. For them, each voyage brought not only goods but also stories to tell, experiences that would mark generations. The Mediterranean, which once seemed immense and daunting, gradually became a vast backyard. The Phoenicians learned to read the winds, observe the stars, and even recognize the scents of ocean currents. This intimacy with the sea gave them the confidence to go further. It's like when someone masters a craft to such a degree that they no longer work out of effort, but out of instinct. The impact of this expansion was profound. Not only did they create colonies and trade routes, but they also brought their traditions, beliefs, and technologies to other peoples. When you exchange goods, you also exchange ideas. And so the Mediterranean world began to resemble less isolated regions and more an interconnected community. And the curious thing is that this expansion wasn't limited to common goods. There were products that would become icons of Phoenician identity, such as the famous purple-dyed cloth. And this seemingly small detail would transform them into a symbol of luxury and power throughout the ancient world. Over time, the Phoenicians stopped sailing solely for adventure and began to organize fixed routes. Egypt, Greece, and Cyprus were like mandatory stops on a well-planned omnibus route. Each port had its own importance. In Egypt, grain and gold; in Greece, olive oil and ceramics; in Cyprus, precious metals. It was a veritable travel calendar, where nothing was by chance. These trade routes functioned like invisible bridges. Imagine a map full of colored lines connecting distant cities, and in the middle of it, the Phoenicians managing everything like conductors of an orchestra. Thanks to this organization, there was no wasted time. Each trip had a specific destination, and each destination guaranteed profit. In Egypt, Phoenician ships were enthusiastically received. They carried glass, wood, and textiles, and returned laden with grain and papyrus. In Greece, they traded wine, olive oil, and artifacts. In Cyprus, they sought copper, which would be essential for bronze production. Each route had its own balance, like a fair exchange that benefited all parties. But it wasn't just about goods. These constant voyages created cultural bonds. Words were exchanged, ideas traveled along with the goods. It was as if each ship also carried a bit of Phoenician identity, spreading it wherever it went. Today, we can compare this to the internet, a means of connection that shortens distances and creates a global network. And there was another fascinating detail. The Phoenicians managed to transform these contacts into relationships of trust. In a time without written contracts as we know them, word of mouth and reputation were the greatest asset. Being recognized as a Phoenician merchant signified credibility, and this trust was what ensured the routes remained open. These routes were the first step towards something even greater, because when trade becomes constant and profitable, so too does the desire to establish a presence. And that's exactly how the first Phoenician colonies, scattered throughout the Mediterranean, were born. Among all the products the Phoenicians traded, none carried as much prestige as purple-dyed fabrics. This color was not only beautiful, it was rare, expensive, and a symbol of power. To produce it, they extracted a pigment from small sea mollusks. Imagine the painstaking work of collecting thousands of shells just to dye a few meters of fabric. It's no wonder only kings and nobles could afford such a luxury. The process was time-consuming and often unbearable due to the strong smell of decomposing mollusks. Phoenician workshops were marked by this intense odor, which spread throughout the coastal cities. To neighbors, it might be unpleasant, but to merchants, that smell was the aroma of profit. It was like the smell of fresh coffee today, a sign that something valuable was being prepared. These fabrics became so coveted that they became status symbols in various cultures. Egyptian kings, Roman magistrates, and even priests insisted on wearing purple to demonstrate their authority. It was like wearing a luxury brand today, something that not only beautifies but also conveys power. Anyone who wore purple was automatically seen as above the rest. The Phoenicians realized they had more than just a product. They had a monopoly. By controlling production and distribution, they guaranteed sky-high prices, and the rarer access to purple became, the more valuable their work became.
This dominance was strategic, like a modern company holding an exclusive patent. The most fascinating thing is to consider the social impact of this color. A piece of purple fabric carried within it not only a vibrant hue, but also a silent message. I have power. This created a circle of desire, where everyone wanted to have it, but few could. And the attentive Phoenicians knew how to exploit this human vanity like no one else. And if purple fabrics cemented the Phoenicians' reputation as luxury merchants, there were other products that ensured their constant presence in foreign markets. Among them, a material that seemed magical at the time, transparent, shiny glass, which would soon gain traction on trade routes. Phoenician glass was considered almost a miracle, transparent, brilliant, and moldable into different shapes. It fascinated those who had never seen anything like it. Imagine, in the ancient world, someone holding a small translucent cup and seeing light shining through it. It was like holding a piece of solidified sunlight, something magical in the eyes of people accustomed only to ceramics and metals. Phoenician artisans developed techniques whose precision was impressive. It wasn't just raw glass. They knew how to transform it into beads, containers, and decorative objects. The sound of the burning furnaces, the artisans' controlled breath, and the incandescent glow of the molten mass created an almost hypnotic scene. It was a craft that combined patience, art, and science before such words even existed. These pieces quickly became luxury items along trade routes. They were purchased by Egyptians, Greeks, and other peoples who saw in glass not only utility but also status. It's like today's high-end cell phone. Beyond its practical function, it carries the weight of being modern, exclusive, and desirable. Phoenician glass had precisely this appeal. Interestingly, many people believed that glass even possessed mystical properties. Because it was transparent, it seemed to connect the visible and the invisible. Some wore glass beads as protective amulets. Others believed that glass containers kept food pure. This detail further increased the product's commercial and symbolic value. By mastering this craft, the Phoenicians not only grew wealthy but also spread their reputation as master craftsmen. Owning a Phoenician object was synonymous with good taste and sophistication, and each piece sold carried the invisible mark of its origin, making Phoenician ports even more sought after. And if glass already demonstrated their ability to transform simple materials into objects of desire, other products also reinforced this skill. Among them, metals traded with precision intelligence, which guaranteed the Phoenicians a central role in Mediterranean trade. The Phoenicians knew that metals were the beating heart of ancient civilization. Tin, copper, and silver were not just raw materials. They were the basis for tools, weapons, ornaments, and even coins. Whoever controlled the flow of these metals controlled much of the economy. And the Phoenicians, with their network of routes, became true masters of this trade. Tin, for example, was essential for the production of bronze, a material that revolutionized technology at the time. However, this metal wasn't found everywhere, so the Phoenicians traveled to distant regions, such as the Iberian Peninsula, to collect it. It was as if they had access to a secret ingredient, capable of keeping an entire system functioning. Copper, abundant in Cyprus, was also a pillar of this trade. It's no wonder the island's name is directly linked to the metal. Imagine the ports filled with ingots gleaming in the sun, ready to be loaded onto Phoenician ships. Each voyage meant new opportunities for profit, and each transaction strengthened their reputation as trustworthy merchants. Silver already had an almost magical value. It was used not only for adornments, but also in high-level transactions. Owning silver meant purchasing power, prestige, and even political security. The Phoenicians knew this and became experts in circulating this metal, transporting it from one side of the Mediterranean to the other. It's like those who control the circulation of oil today, an invisible control but with a gigantic impact. What's interesting is how they managed to transform raw metals into social connections. A batch of tin sold to a Greek blacksmith meant new weapons for those people. A shipment of silver delivered to Egypt could be transformed into statues or temples. The Phoenicians didn't just sell raw materials, they sold possibilities. And this skill in handling metals demonstrated once again how dependent Phoenicia was on foreign resources. After all, if their land didn't offer anything, they sought it from the sea. And when we talk about bringing in foreign products, the next step is to understand how even agriculture came to be acquired through these exchanges. In Phoenicia, the land did not offer agricultural abundance. It was rocky, narrow, and limited, incapable of supporting large plantations. Therefore, the people learned early on that to have bread on the table, they would need to trade. The Phoenicians were not ashamed of this. On the contrary, they transformed their scarcity into a strategy. If they could not produce, they would seek it abroad, and the sea was the way. In the ports of Egypt, ships loaded with wheat and barley. From Greece, they brought olive oil and wine. From Syria, they received dried fruits and spices. Each return voyage was a mixture of smells, grains stored in linen sacks, barrels of olive oil leaking discreetly, the sweet aroma of dates wafting through the cargo. It was almost like opening a pantry of several crops in a single warehouse. These products were not only food, but also currency. Egyptian wheat could be traded for Phoenician timber, Greek wine for purple cloth. It was a constant cycle in which nothing stood still. Imagine today a person who barters between services, always finding a way to generate value from what they had at hand. The Phoenicians were masters at this. This agricultural trade also brought cultures closer together. By bringing Greek olive oil to Egypt, they brought with them the custom of consuming it. By bringing Egyptian grains to Byblos, they introduced new flavors to the Phoenician table. The exchange was material, but also cultural. Essentially, each Phoenician meal had the flavors of many different peoples. It's interesting to consider how this necessity even shaped domestic routines. While other civilizations cultivated their own fields, Phoenician families depended on their livelihood came from the ship's sails, not the farmer's sickle. And this dependence reinforced the idea that the sea was, in fact, the most fertile land they possessed. And while food came from abroad, there was also another wealth that began to circulate intensely, thanks to the Phoenicians' knowledge. Among so many goods, they brought something that would forever change the way people communicate, the alphabet. Among the many Phoenician contributions, perhaps none was as revolutionary as the alphabet. Before them, writing was a privilege of the few, restricted to complicated systems of hieroglyphics or cuneiform script. The Phoenicians simplified everything, creating a reduced set of symbols that represented sounds. It was like exchanging an entire encyclopedia for a pocket manual, accessible, practical, and straightforward. This system not only made life easier for merchants, but also accelerated business. Imagine a merchant jotting down quick contracts on wooden tablets or papyrus without relying on years of trained scribes. The Phoenician alphabet was the ballpoint pen of antiquity, simple, efficient, and capable of spreading rapidly. The most interesting thing is that this alphabet wasn't restricted to Phoenicia. It traveled with ships, crossing seas and reaching people like the Greeks, who adapted it and gave rise to the alphabet we use today. It's curious to think that when typing a message on a cell phone, we are still somehow echoing the Phoenician invention.
This diffusion process occurred almost naturally. Phoenician merchants, as they traded in different ports, taught and learned. They left marks, instructions, and contracts that aroused the curiosity of other peoples. It was as if each voyage was also a traveling writing class. Trade spread not only products, but also symbols, and here's a fascinating point. Writing became a tool of power. Those who knew how to record, knew how to collect, organize, and expand. For the Phoenicians, this meant a competitive advantage. For neighboring peoples, it was a cultural revolution. Imagine living in a world where, suddenly, communication ceases to be a mystery and becomes a skill within the reach of many. And if the alphabet gave the Phoenicians a reputation for innovation, it was their territorial expansion that cemented this influence. Because it wasn't enough to simply bring ideas and goods, they also founded colonies that served as permanent bases throughout the Mediterranean. Over time, the Phoenicians realized that simply passing through ports and exchanging goods wasn't enough. They needed to establish a presence. Thus, the colonies were born, strategic points scattered throughout the Mediterranean. They functioned as extensions of Phoenicia, veritable trading arms that guaranteed security, supplies, and influence in distant lands. The most famous of all was Carthage. Founded in North Africa, strategically located, it quickly became a powerhouse. Imagine a subsidiary that grows so much that at a certain point, it rivals its own parent company. That's exactly what happened. Carthage became so powerful that for a long time it eclipsed even the original cities of Phoenicia. These colonies weren't just warehouses for goods, they were also cultural centers where Phoenician traditions blended with local customs. In the markets of Carthage, for example, one could hear different languages spoken, smell the aroma of oriental spices, and see African products side by side with purple fabrics. It was a multicultural melting pot. Besides Carthage, other important colonies emerged in Sicily, the Iberian Peninsula, and even on smaller islands. Each had a specific function. Some focused on mining, others on fishing or agricultural trade. It was a network so well organized that it resembled modern chain stores, each unit contributing to the strength of the whole. Interestingly, these colonies, even far away, maintained strong ties with the Phoenician city. There was always a reminder of their homeland, their gods, and their customs. At the same time, they gained autonomy, adapting to the local environment. This balance between identity and adaptation was one of the secrets of Phoenician success. And if the colonies represented the material expansion of the Phoenician people, there was also an intellectual expansion occurring in parallel. Because by establishing contact with so many peoples, they ended up being living bridges of knowledge, carrying ideas from the east to the west. The Phoenicians didn't limit their horizons to the Mediterranean. Their roots also extended eastward, reaching regions of Mesopotamia, already centers of culture and wealth. Imagine caravans arriving in cities like Babylon, laden with textiles, glass, and wood, while returning with metals, precious stones, and ideas. It was an exchange that filled not only pockets, but also Mesopotamia offered highly valuable products, such as lapis lazuli, used in jewelry and sacred adornments. For the Phoenicians, transporting these riches meant securing prestigious clients elsewhere. It was like being a distributor of exclusive brands today. Whoever had access to these products automatically gained status. These eastern routes also had a strong cultural dimension. While trading in Mesopotamia, the Phoenicians encountered myths, religions, and even advanced administrative systems. They returned not only with goods but also with stories and lessons learned. It was like an exchange student. They learned more outside the classroom than inside. The East also saw an opportunity in the Phoenicians. For the Mesopotamians, it was advantageous to have experienced navigators who could transport their products to distant destinations. Thus, a win-win partnership was formed. Trust was so strong that Eastern cities often granted special privileges to Phoenician merchants. And of course, this contact left its mark. Words, artistic styles, and even accounting techniques were shared. The sea and the desert were connected by the Phoenician ability to serve as a link. If we speak of globalization today, the Phoenicians already practiced a primitive version of it, uniting seemingly separate worlds. And while in the East they sought riches and wisdom, in the Mediterranean they still faced challenges that went beyond trade. After all, in the open waters there was not always safety. Pirates and rivals also prowled, making each voyage a mix of promise and danger. Sailing the Mediterranean was not only an adventure full of opportunities, but also a journey marked by constant risk. Pirates loomed like shadows on the horizon, ready to attack vessels laden with riches. For the Phoenicians, each voyage was a mixture of hope and tension, like crossing a deserted road knowing there might be robbers lurking nearby. Pirates knew that Phoenician ships were valuable, brimming with fabrics, metals, and glass. It was like watching an armored truck pass by on a modern highway, an irresistible target. Therefore, merchants needed to prepare, arming their vessels and training crews for defense. Life at sea was not only about commerce, but also about military strategy. Besides pirates, there were also rival peoples, Greeks, Etruscans, and even Egyptians, at different times vied for control of trade routes and markets. Each port could be the scene of political tensions. Imagine arriving in a foreign market and discovering that your competitor has already secured contracts with all the best customers. This rivalry turned trade into a silent battle. The Phoenicians, however, learned to balance strength with diplomacy. It wasn't always worth fighting. Often it was better to form alliances. It was like the business world today. Some disputes are resolved through conversation, others require firm resistance. This ability to know when to negotiate and when to fight was one of the secrets of Phoenician survival. Even so, attacks at sea were inevitable. Ancient accounts describe nighttime ambushes, burned ships, and looted goods. For each lost cargo, creativity and courage were required, and curiously, these hardships made the Phoenicians even more resilient, capable of adapting to any obstacle. And it was precisely this mixture of trade, conflict, and adaptation that expanded their cultural influence. Because even when facing enemies, they also absorbed traditions and ideas from these forced contacts, and little by little their presence even shaped the art and religion of other peoples. The Phoenicians left their mark not only through trade, but also through the culture they spread. Each ship that arrived at a port carried more than goods. It brought ideas, styles, and custom. For the Greeks, for example, the Phoenicians were masters at opening doors to new knowledge. It was like having a well-traveled neighbor, always bringing news from distant lands. Phoenician art, full of oriental details and maritime symbols, inspired artisans from various regions. Glass objects, jewelry, delicate, purple-dyed fabrics served as models for other peoples. It's similar to when a fashion emerges in one country and quickly spreads throughout the world. The Phoenician taste for beauty infected everyone who came into contact with it. In religion, they also left traces. Phoenician gods, such as Baal and Astarte, were absorbed and reinterpreted by neighboring cultures. The Romans, for example, inherited indirect influences from this spirituality, adapting symbols and rituals. It was as if each commercial contact was also an invitation to mix beliefs, creating a cultural mosaic that transcended borders. even the language itself was impacted. The Phoenician alphabet, adapted by the Greeks, was the basis for the Latin alphabet, which we still use today. Imagine writing a quick message on your cell phone and realizing that deep down there's an echo of Phoenician genius behind every letter. This legacy is silent but omnipresent, demonstrating how commerce and culture go hand in hand. The Romans, great builders and organizers, also learned from Phoenician commercial efficiency. Many negotiation methods and naval strategies inspired what would later become the Roman Empire. It's like when a small startup creates something that years later is perfected and expanded by a large corporation. The embryo was there, and it was Phoenician. And if Phoenician culture so deeply infiltrated the lives of other peoples, it was also due to the way they handled exchanges and payments. After all, it wasn't just merchandise that circulated, but also different forms of currency and value. The Phoenicians were flexible when it came to trade. They understood that each region had its own trading customs, and they adapted easily. In some places, they used silver coins. In others, barter still predominated. This ability to move between different systems was like speaking several languages. It gave them a huge advantage. In Egypt, for example, it was common to exchange goods directs, grain for wood, papyrus for glass. In Greece, currencies were already gaining currency, and the Phoenicians knew how to leverage this to expedite business. It was just like today, when a company accepts payment in cash, card, or even cryptocurrency. The secret was to never miss an opportunity. Due to a lack of flexibility, this diversity of systems also helped to cement trust. The Phoenician merchant was seen as someone who understood local rules and didn't try to impose his own. This created respectful relationships, something essential in a time without banks or formal contracts. It's like a salesperson who learns the customer's accent and makes them feel at home. And it wasn't just about practicality. The use of precious metals, such as silver, lent credibility to transactions. Carrying ingots was heavy and risky, but it conveyed security. Barter, while simpler, allowed for quick exchanges. The combination of these practices created a vibrant, dynamic trade adapted to each context. This game of adaptation shows how the Phoenicians viewed trade not as a single formula, but as a dance that changed with the music. They knew how to strike the right rhythm in each port, ensuring their ships never returned empty. This ability to adapt would be crucial for navigating long and challenging seas. And speaking of challenging seas, there was a secret behind the Phoenician confidence in venturing ever further afield: the ability to navigate by the stars, a practice that transformed the sky into a map and sailors into readers of the universe. For the Phoenicians, the sky was more than a nocturnal backdrop, it was a reliable guide.
When darkness fell over the Mediterranean, they looked up and read the constellations like a map. The pole star, firmly in the north, was a constant companion, pointing directions on silent nights. It was like having a natural GPS, available to everyone but deciphered only by the most attentive. This knowledge didn't emerge overnight. It was the fruit of patient observation, of sailors who spent entire nights recording patterns. Imagine the scene: men on deck, the cold wind blowing in their faces, counting stars, tracing imaginary lines, and mentally noting the paths the celestial lights indicated. A mixture of science and poetry. Navigating by the stars required discipline. It wasn't enough to just look up. You had to know how to interpret what you saw. This required training, memory, and a special sensitivity. Today we can compare it to the work of airplane pilots who rely on instruments. For the Phoenicians, the stars were these instruments, and each voyage was a test of their precision. This method gave them a clear competitive advantage. While other peoples feared straying from the coast, the Phoenicians dared to cross open seas with confidence. It was like having a secret compass in a time when many navigators still relied solely on intuition. This courage expanded their horizons and opened doors to new routes. Beyond the practical aspect, there was also the spirit. Many Phoenicians believed that the gods had placed the stars in the sky as gifts to guide their children of the sea. Thus, each voyage was also an act of faith, an experience that combined technique and devotion. The starry sky was both an instruction manual and a sacred temple, and if the sky provided direction, the sea offered encounters. Because with each crossing, it wasn't just products that traveled. Ideas, symbols, and even religious beliefs circulated along with the ships. And so it was that the Phoenicians also became disseminators of culture. The Phoenicians didn't just carry goods on their ships. They also carried symbols, beliefs, and artistic inspirations. Each port was a meeting point where gods, stories, and arts intersected. When trading, they also presented their deities, such as Baal and Astarte, and heard about foreign gods. It was like a great cultural fair, where every exchange of goods was accompanied by an exchange of ideas. In art, the impact was equally visible. Phoenician glassware, jewelry, and textiles not only decorated homes, but also inspired local artisans. Likewise, Egyptian and Greek styles found their way into Phoenician cities. Imagine a house decorated with furniture from around the world. Each item tells a different story, but together they form a unique mosaic. Such was the Phoenician aesthetic. This religious exchange had profound effect. Many Phoenician gods were reinterpreted by other peoples. The goddess Astarte, for example, was associated with Aphrodite among the Greeks. This fusion of beliefs created points of connection that brought seemingly distant cultures closer together. It was as if religion served as an invisible bridge between different societies. And it wasn't just about belief, it was also about practices. Phoenician religious festivals, sacrificial rituals, and maritime traditions were absorbed and transformed. Likewise, foreign customs entered their cities, altering even their daily routines. The simple act of eating, dressing, or celebrating could carry a foreign flavor. In music and stories, this exchange was also striking. Songs learned in distant ports were sung by Phoenician sailors on their voyages. Foreign myths mingled with their own, creating hybrid narratives that survived for generations. It was as if each ship were a floating library teeming with different culture, and it was precisely this openness to exchange that strengthened the Phoenicians as cultural mediators. But for all this to happen in an organized manner, it was also necessary to dominate the physical space of the ports, docks, warehouses, and structures that transformed cities into true logistics centers. The Phoenicians knew that successful trade depended not only on ships, but also on the ports that welcomed them. Cities like Tyre and Sidon stood out for their well-planned docks and organized warehouses. Imagine arriving from a long voyage and finding a port with enough space to unload goods, store products, and prepare for the next route. This infrastructure was the key to efficiency. Phoenician docks were built with practicality and durability. Stone blocks formed solid platforms that supported the constant coming and going of ships. The sound of ropes being pulled, wood creaking, and anchors banging against the stone floor was part of the routine. It was a lively environment full of movement and energy. Warehouses were also essential. There, products were carefully stored: sacks of grain, barrels of wine, metal ingots, and fabrics rolled into bales. The scent of spices mixed with the scent of damp wood created a unique atmosphere. These spaces were not just storage facilities, but veritable logistics centers where everything was accounted for and distributed. This organization allowed the Phoenicians to waste no time. While one ship unloaded, another was already preparing to set sail. It was like a large airport today, with landings and takeoffs happening constantly. This dynamic accelerated the flow of trade and kept the economy thriving. Furthermore, the port served as showcases. Arriving foreigners were impressed by the quantity and diversity of goods stocked. It was like entering a shopping mall filled with rare items, each aisle revealing something new. This reinforced Phoenicia's image as an irresistible commercial hub. And this entire port structure was just the foundation for something even greater: the Phoenician presence in distant regions, such as the Aegean Sea and the Iberian Peninsula, where they would expand their routes and consolidate their influence. The Phoenicians weren't content to trade only close to home. They advanced into the Aegean Sea, where they encountered Greek cities eager for new goods, and even reached the southern Iberian Peninsula, a land rich in metal. Imagine the boldness of crossing unknown seas, braving winds and currents to open markets in such distant territories. It was commerce, but also adventure. In the Aegean, their presence was marked by intense exchanges. Glass, textiles, and wood were exchanged for Greek wine, olive oil, and ceramics. Each port became a feast of accents, aromas, and colors. It was like a modern-day international fair, where each culture showcased its best, and this constant contact brought Phoenicians and Greeks closer together, creating mutual influences that still echo throughout history. In the south of the Iberian Peninsula, the main attraction was metals. Tin and silver were abundant, and the Phoenicians knew how to exploit this cleverly. They established colonies and trading posts, ensuring that their routes were not just temporary, but permanent. It was like opening branches of a company at strategic points on the map. This Iberian presence also had a strong cultural side. Local customs blended with Phoenician traditions, creating hybrid societies. Objects found in excavations demonstrate precisely this. Iberian pottery, decorated with Phoenician symbols, evidence of a coexistence that went beyond trade. Mixing was inevitable when different cultures coexisted so closely. The most fascinating thing is to imagine the life of a Phoenician merchant in these lands. Far from Phoenicia, he heard new languages, tried different foods, and adapted to local customs, but never lost his connection to his homeland. He was like a modern expat, living abroad, but always carrying a piece of home within him. And amid this vibrant trade, not all goods were noble or luxurious. There was also a dark side: human trafficking. Among so many goods, the Phoenicians also traded in slaves, a common but brutal practice in the ancient world. Not all Phoenician trade was marked by luxury and sophistication. Among the purple fabrics and gleaming glass, there was also a dark commodity: slaves. This practice, unfortunately common in antiquity, was part of some maritime routes. People captured in war, kidnapped by pirates, or sold by rival nations, were transported on ships, treated as mere cargo. In the ports, the slave trade was a painful spectacle. Men, women, and even children were displayed as if they were objects, evaluated by their strength, appearance, or age. The noise of negotiations mingled with cries and screams of despair. It was a brutal scene that reminded us that trade was not limited to gold and silver, but also involved human lives. For the Phoenicians, this trade was a way to profit in regions where labor demand was constant. Agricultural peoples sought laborers for their fields. Expanding cities needed domestic servants. Thus, Phoenician merchants met this need, without questioning the cruelty behind the practice. It was the cold logic of the market overcoming compassion. This dark aspect also highlights the complexity of ancient trade. The same ships that carried culture, art, and knowledge often transported people uprooted from their home. It's a stark contrast, like a coin with two sides. On one side, progress and connection; on the other, pain and exploitation. The impact of this wasn't just economic.
Slaves taken to other lands ended up carrying with them fragments of their own culture, cuisine, music, customs. Many of them were forced across borders. Thus, even amidst suffering, the presence of these people also contributed to the cultural mosaic of the Mediterranean. And if the slave trade exposes the harshest side of Phoenician expansion, the internal political functioning reveals another curious aspect: the decentralization of the city-states, which lived independently but were linked by common interests. Phoenicia was not a large, unified empire, but a collection of independent city-states. Each had its own ruler, laws, and even ambitions. It was like a group of siblings sharing the same house, but each arranged their room as they pleased. This decentralization provided flexibility but also generated rivalries. Tyre, Sidon, and Byblos were the most famous, but they weren't the only ones. There were dozens of smaller cities, each with its own port, merchants, and identity. Interestingly, even though they were independent, they all shared the same maritime and commercial spirit. It's like modern cities that compete with each other but also grow stronger through exchanges. This political independence sometimes became a problem.
When external threats arose, it was difficult to organize a common defense. Imagine a team where each player wants to shine alone. Unity is lacking. Yet, this characteristic also made the Phoenicians more resilient, because the fall of one city didn't mean that Another interesting point is that decentralization favored innovation. As each city sought to stand out, it invested in its own improvements, whether in naval techniques, crafts, or trade routes. This healthy competition drove growth. It was like having several startups competing in the same industry, each trying to launch the next big product. Daily life in these cities was intense. Narrow streets bustled with merchants, markets crowded with foreigners, and temples reflected local religiosity. The sound of negotiations mingled with religious ceremonies, creating an atmosphere that was both vibrant and chaotic. Each city had its own soul, and this diversity was Phoenicia's strength. And of course, to maintain this independence from giant empires like Egypt or Assyria, the Phoenicians needed diplomacy. Their political relations were as important as their trade, and this is where we come to another crucial aspect: the alliances and diplomatic agreements that sustained their survival. The Phoenicians, despite their small size, were great diplomats. They knew they couldn't face empires like Egypt or Assyria by military force, so they invested in alliances, treaties, and gifts. They were like that smart neighbor who, instead of fighting with the landlord, offers favors and maintains a good relationship. This strategy ensured their survival. With Egypt, for example, the relationship was long-standing. From early on, the Phoenicians supplied cedar wood, textiles, and glass in exchange for grain and gold. The pharaohs saw them as strategic partners, essential for building temples and palaces. Imagine an Egyptian ruler planning a grand construction project. Without Phoenician cedar, many projects would never have come to fruition. These diplomatic relations went beyond the exchange of goods. They often involved political marriages, the sending of ambassadors, and even religious cooperation. It was a network of mutual favors, where each side benefited. For the Phoenicians, this meant protection. For the empires, it meant access to exclusive product. Phoenician diplomatic skill was also evident in their neutrality. Rather than choosing sides in major conflicts, they preferred to stay in the middle, negotiating with everyone. This stance resembled a mediator in a family dispute. They didn't take sides, but always came away with some benefit. It was a lesson in political pragmatism. However, this dependence on alliances also made them vulnerable. When an empire grew too strong, Phoenician cities had to submit, paying tribute or accepting imposition. Yet they managed to turn submission into opportunity, keeping their ports active and their trade routes functioning. And it was precisely this ability to balance interests that allowed them to grow. But beyond diplomacy, they had another powerful weapon in their arsenal:
the ability to form advantageous trade alliances, which guaranteed not only protection but also constant profits. The Phoenicians were true strategists when it came to trade. They knew they couldn't dominate the entire Mediterranean alone. Therefore, they sought intelligent trade alliances, always with an eye on mutual gain. It was like playing chess. Every move was calculated, and each partnership served as a crucial piece in opening up new moves on the maritime board. These alliances often arose from trust built along the trade routes. A Phoenician merchant who kept his word in Athens could years later gain exclusive privileges in its ports. It was like that friend who always pays his bills on time. Soon, everyone wants to trade with him. Credibility was his strongest currency. Some of these partnerships went beyond simple trade. They involved land concessions for colonies, tax privileges, or even exclusive rights to certain products. The Phoenicians offered their fast ships and safe routes in exchange for access to local riches. It was a win-win situation in which, in the end, they always emerged stronger. Their intelligence also lay in never putting all their eggs in one basket. While they formed alliances with one people, they maintained contacts with their rivals. Thus, even in times of conflict, they were able to continue trading. It's like a company that, instead of relying on a single client, diversifies its portfolio to ensure stability. These alliances also shaped diplomacy. Rulers knew that having the Phoenicians as trading partners meant access to luxury goods, metals, and technical expertise. Therefore, many accepted favorable terms simply to maintain this partnership. Respect was earned not by the sword, but by contract. And yet, as masterful as they were at forging alliances, the Phoenicians were not immune to great military powers. At decisive moments, such as the Assyrian invasions, their cities were put to the test. And it is precisely at this point that we see how external pressures began to undermine their autonomy. Phoenician cities, though rich and influential, were not immune to the brute force of great empires. In the 8th century BC, the Assyrians, known for their violence and military discipline, set their sights on the Phoenician coast. The impact was devastating. Ports were sacked, rulers were subdued, and heavy tributes were imposed. It was as if a predator had found a herd too lucrative to ignore. The Assyrians weren't just interested in military dominance, they also wanted to control trade. For them, Phoenician ports were gateways to the Mediterranean, strategic points for expanding their influence. Imagine an empire that, instead of just conquering land, also sought to dominate trade routes and distribution centers. That's exactly what they did. For the Phoenicians, this new reality meant adaptation. Many local rulers agreed to pay tribute in exchange for maintaining a measure of autonomy. It was a fragile balance, almost like renting the house was yours, but you had to hand over a considerable portion of your earnings to the landlord. Still, they preferred this to complete destruction.
This submission, however, did not prevent the cities from continuing to prosper. Even under Assyrian rule, Tyre and Sidon maintained active markets, with ships departing and arriving daily. This proved that for them, trade was stronger than any invasion. They might lose political freedom, but they did not lose the ability to trade. Interestingly, this relationship also brought cultural exchanges. Phoenician art reached Assyria, while Assyrian symbols began to appear in Phoenician ports. It was a forced exchange, but one that left profound marks on both sides. Even oppression ended up generating a circulation of ideas. And if the Assyrians were a shadow over the Phoenicians, another even greater challenge would arise later: the rise of Carthage, which would cease to be a simple colony to become the great Phoenician power in the Mediterranean. While the cities of Phoenicia were dealing with pressure from empires like Assyria and Babylon in North Africa, a colony was growing impressively. Carthage. Founded by Phoenicians from Tyre, it soon ceased to be dependent and began to shine with its own light. It was like a child who, as he grows up, surpasses his parents in wealth and power. Carthage enjoyed a privileged location right in the center of the Western Mediterranean. From there, it controlled routes leading to both the Iberian Peninsula and Sicily. This strategic position, combined with the ingenuity inherited from the Phoenicians, made the city a naval power. Carthaginian ships were numerous, fast, and intimidating. Meanwhile, the city-states of Phoenicia were weakening under invasions and tributes imposed by neighboring empires. Decentralization, once a strength, became a weakness. It was difficult to resist in a united manner. Carthage, on the other hand, had a strong centralized government, capable of organizing large armies and fleets. The balance of power began to tip. Over time, the ports of Phoenicia lost some of their relevance. Merchants preferred to trade directly with Carthage, which offered stability and protection. Imagine a traditional company losing market share to a young, aggressive startup that dominates the sector in just a few years. That's exactly what happened to the Phoenicians. Still, there was pride in seeing a Phoenician colony dominate the scene. In a sense, Carthage was the continuation of their legacy, but there was also melancholy. The glory that once belonged to Tyre, Sidon, and Byblos was now transferred to another land. It was the end of one era and the beginning of another, marked by colossal battles against the Romans. And in this process of transformation, Phoenician identity did not disappear. On the contrary, it was absorbed, mixed, and perpetuated in other cultures. And this is where we enter the theme of legacy, an aspect that shows how, even in decline, they were never forgotten. The political decline of the Phoenician cities did not mean the end of their influence. On the contrary, their culture was absorbed and transformed by the Greeks and Romans. It was as if the peoples who came after had inherited a chest full of cultural treasures, and instead of leaving it to be stored away, used it to build something even greater. The Greeks, for example, adapted the Phoenician alphabet, creating the basis for the writing system that would shape the entire Western tradition. It was a true bridge. Without the Phoenicians, Greek literature as we know it today might not have existed. It was as if a seed planted on the coast of Lebanon had blossomed in the hands of poets and philosophers. The Romans, in turn, inherited commercial and maritime practices. They were inspired by Phoenician port organization and even their method of expanding colonies. It wasn't copying, but reinvention. They took the model and adapted it to their imperial needs. Thus, what began as small and decentralized in Phoenicia became a colossal machine under Rome. This absorption can even be seen in religion. Phoenician gods were reinterpreted, given new names and roles in other pantheons. It's curious to note how symbols of fertility, prosperity, and war spanned centuries, changing only their guises. It was a reminder that ideas are as resilient as well-built ships. Phoenician art also left its mark. Glass techniques, jewelry, and decorative motifs appear in Greek and Roman finds, as if they were an invisible signature in time. Each piece unearthed in excavations is proof that even without large armies, the Phoenicians conquered the Mediterranean through taste, aesthetics, and utility. And if the Greeks and Romans absorbed so much from Phoenician culture, it was because there was an irresistible legacy there, a legacy that wasn't limited to the present, but would echo through the very foundation of Western civilization. And this brings us to the final point. The Phoenicians' lasting impact on Mediterranean trade and history. The Phoenicians' greatest legacy lies not only in the products they sold, but in the trade model they created. They demonstrated that the sea could be more than a barrier. It could be a bridge between cultures. This mindset transformed the Mediterranean into a space for exchange. Long before it became the cradle of Western civilization, it was as if they had written the first pages of a globalization manual. Their roots created connections that united distant peoples, allowing ideas, technologies, and even beliefs to travel alongside goods. Each ship was a floating library, carrying more than cargo. It carried knowledge. It was thanks to this movement that agricultural practices, artistic styles, and forms of writing circulated rapidly throughout the ancient world. The economic impact was also enormous. By introducing more sophisticated forms of trade, the Phoenicians paved the way for complex markets that would later be developed by the Greeks and Romans. They pioneered the idea that wealth comes not only from land, but also from the ability to connect distant demands and supplies. To this day, the Phoenician spirit echoes across the great maritime trade routes. When we look at cargo ships crossing the oceans, we are in a sense seeing a direct legacy from those who, millennia ago, ventured out in small wooden vessels. The logic is the same: connect, distribute, and prosper. But perhaps their greatest legacy is invisible: the adaptive mindset. The Phoenicians taught that limitations can be transformed into opportunity, that the lack of fertile land was not an obstacle, but an invitation to seek riches elsewhere. This lesson remains valid for anyone who, faced with difficulties, finds in the challenge a path to growth. And so, even though the Phoenician cities have disappeared from the political map, their influence lives on in trade, writing, culture, and even in the way we understand the sea. There is always a piece of Phoenicia reminding us that connections are humanity's true wealth. Now that you know the Phoenicians' journey, tell me, what are you doing with your own limitations? Will you continue to see them as barriers, or will you turn each one into an opportunity, as they did? After all, if a people without fertile lands manage to dominate the Mediterranean, why can't you conquer your own space in the world? Think about it. What seas are you still afraid to sail? Is it at work, in your personal life, in your study? How many opportunities have passed you by simply because you believed you didn't have enough resources? Maybe it's time to turn the page and realize that, like the Phoenicians, you don't need to have everything to achieve everything. And I want to hear from you. What part of this story inspired you most? What Phoenician lesson do you think you could apply to your life today? Leave a comment, because your experience might help others too. If you've made it this far, you've already realized knowledge has power, but it only transforms when it's put into practice. So don't let this story die as curiosity. Use it to fuel your own journey. And of course, if this content made sense to you, subscribe to the channel, activate the bell, and continue browsing with me these stories that school never told, but that can change the way you see life.